Okay, everybody, I think we're ready to start. So, I'd like to welcome all of you people I can't see to this meeting. Hello, everybody, on behalf of the full Brexit. My name's Mary Davis. I'm a Labour historian and a Labour movement activist and, of course, a signatory to the full Brexit. This meeting is to launch Paul Embery's book, Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class, published by Polity. This, I think, on December the 3rd. It's not yet published, although I have read it, I have to say. And it's now available to order, I'm told, from all good bookshops. I don't really know any good bookshops, but anyway, it's available in bookshops. Now, I'm supposed to be a very impartial chair, and I'll try to be. And I'm going to introduce Paul. I have read his book, and I've got to say, Paul, I don't agree with all of it, but I'm very glad indeed that you've written it. Paul Embery is a lifelong trade unionist. He's a member of the Fire Brigades Union, and I gather he's also a member of the NUJ. That's interesting. And he is a columnist for Unheard. So I gather that his book has already aroused a great amount of controversy on what I call anti-social media. I don't ever look at these things, but I'm told that it's been quite controversial. So, Paul, I think I can rely on you to be controversial, and that's just as well. There are three speakers, or two, including two others, including in addition to Paul. Paul's going to get the longest time because it is his book after all. He's going to be followed. I'll be quite strict on time, by the way, Paul, so 15 to 20 minutes and then I'm going to say stop. He's going to be followed by Maurice Glasman, who I think I'll introduce when it comes to it. You've only got 7 minutes, Maurice, and he's going to be followed by Philip Cunliffe, who also will have 7 minutes. That will leave plenty of time for sensible questions and sensible discussion. So, Paul, it's great pleasure that I'd like to introduce you to introduce your book.
Paul, you're muted. Unmute yourself.
Start from the beginning, Paul. Nobody heard anything.
My apologies, everybody. Can you hear me now, Mary? Okay. My apologies, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me now. So thank you, Mary, for the introduction. Thanks to everybody for attending. Very nice of you all to turn up in my small dining room on a cold Friday evening. I should say, Mary, the book is actually published today. I also saw some publicity suggesting the 3rd of December, but it's actually today that the book is actually published. And yes, it has stirred some interest, and I think that's a good thing because it's most certainly a debate that needs to be had. We need to discuss why it is that the left is so removed, both physically and ideologically, from so many of our working class communities, why a chasm has opened up between it and them, and why so many voters in so-called red wall seats chose to elect at the last election a Tory party led by an old Etonian, which had spent a decade imposing austerity throughout the nation, and what it might take for the left, and particularly the Labour Party, to win the trust of those communities again. And the book argues that the disconnect emerged because increasingly the values of many on what I call the modern left have diverged from the values of many people living in our working class communities, particularly in many of our provincial and post-industrial and coastal communities. And these are communities which have not benefited in any obvious way from globalisation. In fact, they're more likely to have suffered its more unsettling effects in the form of deindustrialisation and rapid demographic change. And these are very often hard-pressed areas where people are on low wages and living in substandard housing, limited opportunity for travel, self-advancement, and so on. But they're also, and in many respects because of these things, more likely to place a high value on place and belonging and community and social solidarity. Because the truth is, when people's life chances are limited in that way, those kinds of concepts do take on so much more meaning. And yet they experience the negative effects of globalisation in terms of their often acute economic and social disruptions that they bring, in a way that much of the wealthier parts of the nation living in our more fashionable cities don't particularly experience. And it's my assessment that many in these working class communities, not all by any stretch, but certainly many, will often have fairly what you might call traditional views, what some would say small c conservative views around things like family and law and order and immigration and so on. And they're often quite patriotic. They've got a strong sense of right and wrong. They like the armed forces. Many of them like the monarchy. They tend to be quite communitarian in their outlook, and they don't particularly have much time for the kind of cosmopolitan liberal globalism that much of today's left now embraces with enthusiasm. And it's these people who I think have absolutely shaken up British politics, particularly with the Brexit vote and the 2019 election. And they shook it up because they, in the end, I think, were sick and tired of being ignored and patronised, and of being told that their concerns were not legitimate and were misguided, of being told that the storms of globalisation they were experiencing were actually good for them because it would bring the nation improved GDP, it would bring their communities cultural enrichment and so on. And I think they were sick and tired, frankly, of being made to feel like museum pieces in their own country, of being labelled at the extreme, things like bigots and gammon and xenophobes and that kind of thing. Now, I think the interesting thing is that these people were once the backbone of the Labour Party. They were proud to vote for it. The party was proud to have them. But I think that now these sorts of people are treated by Labour and many people on the wider left as though they were some kind of embarrassing elderly relative. They want their votes at election time, but they don't particularly want to be seen in public with them, and they don't really like the stuff they believe in. And if they vote for something as terrible and backward thinking as Brexit, God forbid, then they must really be told they've got it wrong and they've got to vote again. And I think that this attitude has become more prevalent within the Labour movement as the Labour Party itself has undergone a pretty significant demographic change itself in the past couple of decades. Particularly, Labour has become, I think, much more middle class as an organisation, more rooted in the cities, particularly London-centric. It's adopted a much more militantly cosmopolitan liberal worldview, and so no longer particularly looks or sounds like the millions in those post-industrial communities. And naturally, this has meant that Labour's language and messaging has increasingly moved away from the core issues that exercise those communities and towards what I would see as much more middle class causes and concerns. So, you know, Labour has spent much of the past 30 years, for example, banging the drum for economic and social liberalism when much of its traditional vote was the other way on those things. And many in these working class communities are, I think, perfectly happy with a programme for a fairer and more equal economy. They support redistribution of wealth. They think the richest should pay more tax. They want to see things like boardroom excesses and regional inequalities tackled. They support increases in the minimum wage, stronger workers' rights, investment in public services and so on. And I think, in fairness to Jeremy Corbyn, whatever criticisms I would have of him, the Labour Party under him did at least start articulating some of that kind of stuff in a way that I think previous leaders were reluctant to do. But I think the big point about that is that if there's one thing that the 2017 and 2019 elections taught us, it's that promises of economic and workplace justice alone simply are not enough. Working class people want something more. They want something that goes beyond promises of money and individual rights. They want a bit of stability. They want a bit of cultural security, not in a way that's hostile or exclusionary, but in a way that protects their communities from the swift and deep-seated changes that can come from the global market. And they want, frankly, a return to the politics of belonging, the politics of place, the politics of community, economic fairness, yes, but stable communities, strong families, good, well-paid jobs where people have dignity and pride in their work. And they also, I sense, want an end to this increasingly suffocating atmosphere in which certain views are considered off limits and not worthy of being expressed in polite society and worthy of excommunication, in which, you know, an arrogant liberal class who hold so much sway now across our public institutions and across our media essentially think they can decide on behalf of everyone else what opinions are acceptable and what aren't, and where people are silenced basically or cancelled if they don't conform. And it's this kind of approach, and again I have to say the modern left is up to its neck in this stuff, that serves only to widen that chasm between more traditional voters and the Labour Party and the wider left. And I think also these communities, when they speak through the ballot box, as they did with Brexit, they expect their decision to be honoured. Now, I'm not suggesting we reopen Brexit here tonight, and though I voted Leave, I know many decent people across the political spectrum who voted Remain. But I do think the reaction of large parts of the left to that particular vote, which was, let us not forget, one of the biggest democratic exercises in our nation's history, and one in which vast numbers of working class people took part, many of them voting for the first time. The attempts by many on the left subsequently to block that vote and overturn it were not only wrong in principle in my view, but they were suicidal as a tactic, and that I think came with a very, very heavy price that the left is going to be paying off for years. I saw Brexit as a genuine democratic revolt, one made largely, not exclusively, but largely by working class voters, and the way I think that the left's leaders were complicit in trying all sorts of manoeuvrings to subvert it was a massive own goal, and I think that was proven beyond doubt at the last election. So, as one reviewer of the book said earlier this week quite rightly, the book doesn't come to bury Labour on the left, but to save it. I've been a Labour member, a trade unionist for a quarter of a century. I want to see the movement succeed. But I think it can only do that if it stops sneering at its old working class base and treating the views of that base as somehow illegitimate on a whole range of things. And Labour and the wider left need to, frankly, get off the territory of identity politics and open borders globalism and back to the everyday concerns and stresses of working class communities, in my view. And I also think the left needs to think again about its aversion to the whole principle of the nation state. I know many on the left think the nation state is a terrible thing, that it divides people, that it gives rise to nationalism. And of course it can do all of those things at the extreme, but it's also, in my view, the best form of government yet invented at its upper level. It can be a force for good, particularly in a world where global corporations hold so much sway and themselves are completely in favour of the no borders philosophy, which allows them to move their capital around the world freely, and in doing so to exert huge pressure on elected national governments and undermine democracy in that way. And there's nothing that the cheerleaders for globalisation, in my view, would like more than the gradual erosion of the nation state to anything more than something just symbolic, really. And if we want to stop them having their way and having those freedoms to exploit working people and developing countries in the way they do, then I think the reassertion of the nation state wouldn't be a bad thing, and that the left should rethink its hostility to it. And again, not least because many working class communities themselves feel a natural affinity for their country and don't particularly like any suggestion that that's been born from some kind of feeling of superiority or a hangover of imperialism. And I think, as I say in the book, that the Labour Party itself was always a historic electoral compromise between Hartlepool and Hampstead, with Hartlepool the greater part of that alliance. And it's always been most successful when it's managed to hold that coalition together. But in my view, it's undeniable that over recent years, that coalition has become seriously imbalanced, and the party is almost now all Hampstead and not enough Hartlepool. And that means that the pendulum, I think, must start shifting decisively the other way and quickly. It is without question the Labour Party these days, a party largely for students and social activists and middle-class liberals living in the cities. I'm not suggesting for a moment that those people don't belong in the party or that they should be purged. On the contrary, I think they've got much to offer, but they need to accept that their own worldview is not the dominant one in many working class communities, the ones they claim to speak for. And it's because of their attempts to impose their own worldview on those communities that they've created that rupture with them. And at the end of the day, there's no route back to power for Labour and the left that does not pass through those red wall seats and seek to win the votes of those living there. That needs to be Keir Starmer and Labour's and the left's guiding mission over the next 4 years. And as a trade unionist too, I think trade unions, I'm a proud trade unionist, I think trade unions need to take a hard look at themselves. Many in the movement have bought into this whole kind of woke liberal identity politics agenda, and they've lost sight of the importance of bread and butter campaigning over the core issues that motivate workers, jobs, pay, conditions, and so on. And the truth is, it's a tragedy that trade unions are largely absent from much of private industry and have retreated to their public sector comfort zone. And this means again that the wider Labour movement just has no presence in those post-industrial communities where workers still need the protection of a union just as much as they ever did, not least because they're working in insecure, low-paid employment, perhaps in a call centre or in the gig economy and so on. So I'll conclude on this. There's much for the Labour movement to do. There's an absolute mountain to climb. I'm a member of the movement. I'm proud to be a member of the movement and I want it to succeed. But that mountain cannot be climbed. It can't even begin that task until the left starts reconnecting with working class voters, understanding their concerns, respecting their sense of place and community, respecting their small c conservative views in some cases, and not looking down and sneering at them for those beliefs and opinions. And I set out those arguments in much more detail in the book, and I hope that the book is seen as a worthy contribution to the debate, and I hope that that people read it. So that's it from me, and thank you everyone for listening. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. Really not too controversial as far as I'm concerned, and that was excellent. And we're going to take questions after all the speakers have spoken. And the next speaker is Maurice Glasman, who is he's a leading political theorist. Maurice, you are, and he's a member. He's a founder of Blue Labour, and he's, in case you didn't know, he's Lord Glasman. He's a Labour member of the House of Lords. You're very, very welcome, Maurice, and it's over to you now.
Thanks, Mary, and really well done, Paul. You know, to be a sneery, condescending, middle-class dweller of the urban, I'm very proud of you. I remember Paul and I organised a seminar at university and on all this stuff, and we were just walking into the university and Paul turned around to me and said, "Oh, never been inside a university before." So I think this is a lesson for academics, that if you want to write a book that people actually read, you know, don't go to university, I think is one of the conclusions that you can draw. So really, really well done. And just to say, I'm looking through the list of attendants, I can't, but just to say hi to Cheryl and to Pauline and to Jenny and to David. It's really good that you're here. And, you know, what Paul's done is bring together, you know, I think a book of the new point, and obviously to say to all my friends in the full Brexit, it's really good that you've organised this, and particularly to Lee and to Andrew and to Philip for organising it. And what we see is the emergence where there is a stronger role for the nation state. That's now unavoidable during the COVID crisis in the economy, and yet Labour and the left seem to be unable to really grasp its constructive role in reversing globalization. I noticed that Liz argued, you know, what is the difference between left and right? You know, central to this has got to be the rejection, the critique of globalization, the real elimination of the state, an opposition to the elimination of labour and labour value, a genuine commitment to democracy and extending democracy, and a defence of the liberties. Liz, I just wanted to say that that's where I place the divide. And Janet raised, you know, why are you still in Labour? Well, I think for Paul as well as myself, the Labour tradition itself is a source of inspiration in that people associated, organised together, buried each other, organised into unions to defend the human status of the worker, developed a genuine politics of place. And all of this is present in Paul's book. So what do I think of where does Paul's book fit in? Well, I think it's a really important intervention in asserting what is the framework of the post-globalization politics. I think that what's happened is we've seen a gradual rejection. And what are the three main features of that? Well, Paul raises them. The first is a genuinely that the state has no choice but to be more involved in the economy. And David asked in the discussion, well, what does that mean for the left? I think it means very importantly to recognize that capital has centralized and concentrated its power, that essentially it's removed itself in asset form from the vast majority of the country. And so what's required would be, you know, the endowment of regional banks so that people can have access to capital. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect that Paul has really read is that for the 40 years previous, in the governing consensus that we all lived under and knew so well, it was considered that labour and work and the working class in particular were no longer a historically important thing, that they, you know, they could be taken for granted, they were an irrelevance, they were declining. What we saw and lived through during the Brexit interregnum was the re-emergence of the working class as a political agent, as having political agency. And then what we saw with the election of the Conservative government last year is how Labour had ceased to be an object of affection for so many parts of the working class, and in fact hostile. And I think that Paul brings that out really strongly in the book, and I think you actually articulate it really well. So the first thing is the nation state. The second is that class is crucial to this, and is not an irrelevant thing. And I think that Paul's development of the relationship between sort of globalization and identity politics is really well done. The way that corporate capitalism has got completely behind that, and the really hard issue of how you build a broad-based class politics that includes immigrants and locals, that find space and leadership role for women is really excellently done. And the third thing that Paul brings into attention, which was considered irrelevant, was the importance of place. This has been developed in the whole distinction between hubs and heartlands, but essentially the places where people live really matters. And under globalization, they didn't matter at all. They were, you know, there was some lip service to the left behind and the losers of globalization. It was a real horror for the progressive globalizers when the losers won. I think that was one of the shocking things that happened, and that Paul captures really well. So the question is for us, you know, Paul read, you know, around about page 105, 106, you know, what steps is the left taking to develop a political economy and an industrial strategy that genuinely revives places and gives a space for working class participation? I think that as well as regional banks and vocational colleges as vital institutions through which the trade unions could renew their relationship with workers in the private sector. I think also the worker representation on boards, a third of the seats on boards would be a good way to go. Just to articulate a negotiated settlement, Paul sometimes used the words common good, that we've got to, you know, stop or disengage from this relentless polarization and find a space through which democracy can be embedded in politics in the locality, but also within the economy, that workers have actual status in recognition of their skills, but also recognition within firms, and that they don't have to move from the places that they live in order to live a good life and a fulfilled life. Now, obviously, what we've had with COVID is a real challenge to that, in that what you have, you know, one definition of the working class that I'd put forward is it's something that you can't do from home, that you have to leave the house and do something for other people, on the whole involving your hands. But what we've seen is the really the consolidation of the power of the internet oligarchs. That's one huge feature of this. The you know, disintegration in some, you know, in a real way of political association. So a real difficulty in articulating politics in relation to this, and obviously the emergence of a, you know, this coalition, as I put it, between the City of London and the Chinese Communist Party in order to eliminate labour as a genuine factor of production, as well as democracy and liberty. So, Paul, I think you've done a really tremendous job in staying true to democracy, in defending the liberties and articulating a politics of class that is, in fact, a really important contribution. And this is directed to David and others who were asking of how the left can build a genuine political programme that can, you know, offer a common good between estranged interests, in which the working class play a leading role from all backgrounds. So, Paul, I'm actually quite touched, and I really, really congratulate you.
Thank you very. Oh, is that it? Sorry, Maurice, have you?
No, I hope that was in time. That was what I was asking.
You've got a couple of minutes more if you want to go on. Don't feel obliged, though. You're muted, Maurice.
It's fine. I'll leave it there.
Well, it was good. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, well, our next speaker is Philip Cunliffe. Philip is a senior lecturer. Oh, God, he's a lecturer. I shouldn't say that, should I? But we don't mean that we don't like people who don't go to, who've been to universities, do we, Maurice? We don't mean that at all, because we like Philip. Philip is a senior lecturer in international conflict at the University of Kent. So, Philip, over to you.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to everyone. I'm delighted to be here. So I'd like to offer my congratulations to Paul as well. It's a fantastic read, and it's compelling and engaging. And there are, I mean, it's also filled with the kinds of facts and details that I know I'm going to be using myself significantly in all sorts of the arguments that I'm sure I'm going to be involved with over the next few years. I was also, I mean, I should also say it's not only kind of compelling and engaging, but Paul also writes movingly of the transformation of Barking. And I was especially intrigued to read about how Paul says that earlier and when he was younger, he was in fact himself a liberal globalist. And I was interested because it prompted me to think about my own intellectual development and my own intellectual trajectory, my own political, the development of my own political ideas. And it made me think about how I think, at least I hope, I managed a lucky escape from turning into a woke leftist. So I would be curious, in fact, to hear more about how it was that Paul's own politics and views changed from those of liberal globalism before. So where I would, I suppose, want to push Paul more is with respect to his conclusions. So it seems to me that in terms of beyond the analysis, in terms of the political pitch that Paul offers in the book, it's essentially a pitch to the middle classes, to the middle class wing of the Labour Party and to the middle classes on the left. And Paul makes the case, I mean, very convincingly, that Hampstead needs Hartlepool if the Labour Party and if the left want an electoral route back to power. And I suppose I would reverse it and ask, if Hampstead needs Hartlepool, does Hartlepool really need Hampstead? And I suppose that's the question that I would want to put to Paul. I would also say and one point perhaps where I would diverge from Paul is that I think, if anything, he underestimates the depth of middle class hatred for the working class. Its hatred of that bitterness and intensity and depth doesn't emerge suddenly. It's been brewing for a very long time. It's been there for a very long time, and it's been given free rein. It's not a cultural excess, I don't think, and it's not a kind of a temporary derangement. I think it speaks the cultural snobbery and hatred and contempt that Paul recounts so effectively in the book. I think that speaks not to cultural differences so much as separate political interests and sharp political divergences between the middle classes and the working class. So Paul also makes the case that traditional labour values have been eroded by the middle classes. Traditional labour values, traditional working class values have been substituted by liberalism, and that the liberal middle classes have imposed their views and values on the working classes effectively, politically, over the last 30 years or so. But I would say, I suppose, that one traditional identity that the working class has cast off without the middle class is that of being Labour voters. They have thrown off that traditional identity in the Midlands and in the north of England. And my second question would be, why try to reimpose that most traditional and musty and old-fashioned of identities on the voters of the Red Wall, a traditional identity that they've so roundly rejected? And I suppose my final, the final provocation to wrap up, the final point I would put across is, so Paul puts forward the idea that what we need more, and this has been echoed by Maurice, is a politics of culture and community and belonging. While, you know, I don't think that those are necessarily unappealing things. I don't think that's what we need. In fact, I think instead of that politics, I think we need a politics of control. And Brexit, if it was anything, it was a demand for greater control. The slogan after this, the slogan that won was "Take back control." I think it would be a very dangerous mistake to offer people culture instead of control. I think it would be a dangerous mistake to offer people community instead of control. I also think it would be unwise to turn the working class into yet another oppressed identity group. I think all of those things would be a profound misreading of the politics of Brexit. So I suppose my final point that I would want to put to Paul, to our listeners, to the participants in the debate, and to Maurice and to everyone else, would be not a politics of culture, place and belonging, but a politics of control, which is to say a politics of democracy and sovereignty. And what people choose to do with that is obviously, by definition, that's something that would be put in their hands. But it seems to me, like I say, it would be a grave error to substitute culture for control. So thank you. Thanks for your attention. And I look forward to hearing what people have to say and to hearing further from Paul as well.
Thanks very, very much, Philip. There are a lot of questions, but Philip has specifically directed questions to you, Paul, and also there is another question that is directed specifically to you. So I'm going to pose those two first. So you've heard Philip's. Lee Jones says that he enjoyed the book, but he thinks that you didn't really answer the question in the subtitle, which is why the modern left loathes the working class. You show in many ways how they hate them, but why do they? So can I leave you, Paul, to answer those questions first, and then later, when you've done that, we'll go on another round for more general questions.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I mean, on the last point there from Lee, I think there's, and I think this is symbolic of so much of the groupthink that exists on the modern left today, that people who are part of that group, you know, the kind of middle class urban liberal with a militantly liberal cosmopolitan globalist worldview, often tend to mix in their own particular circles, it strikes me that these people often preach diversity to everybody else, but when you actually look at their own social networks, they're actually quite exclusive and tend to comprise of people just like themselves. And I think the whole thing becomes self-perpetuating in the sense that they don't go into the working class communities. They don't particularly speak to people in those communities. So they just have this complete caricature of what those communities are like, and they think of themselves and they reinforce it with each other in their own kind of enlightened in-groups, what they perceive to be their own enlightened in-groups, simply as if they're inherently better people, that their views are the progressive views, their views are the enlightened views, and therefore these working class people in provincial Britain and in post-industrial Britain really need to catch up. Ultimately, I think it's just a patronising attitude and an innate feeling of superiority. In terms of Philip's, I'll try to deal, I think I scribbled all of them down that Philip raised. In terms of Philip's question about, you know, what changed my view from being someone with a pretty relaxed view about liberal globalism and actually embracing the precepts of it. I think it was a very personal thing. You know, I lived in those years in Barking and Dagenham, as I described in the book, when it really was caught in the eye of the storm nationally around the whole debate on globalisation and immigration. And we saw there in 2006, 12 BNP councillors elected. The BNP had never previously really had a foothold in that borough. I think they've got one councillor in 2004, but other than that, nothing. They'd penetrated other parts of East London, but never Barking and Dagenham. And it took just a few years for them to come out of nowhere and to absolutely turn the politics of the borough upside down. And you get to a point, I certainly got to a point where I realised that what people were telling me in that community wasn't born from racism or xenophobia or hatred towards other people. It was born from a genuine sense of violation of their own sense of place. And the way that I describe it in the book is that they were going through rapid deindustrialisation, rapid demographic change, caught in a perfect storm with those things. And it wasn't that their sense of race had been violated, it was that their sense of order had been violated, and these people weren't actually hostile to newcomers. And I think the tragic thing is actually they were as tolerant as people elsewhere in Britain, and I think would have accepted change at a normal pace. Change is inevitable, no one's suggesting things can ever stay the same, but because change was unleashed at such a scale and at such a pace, it just completely disorientated and bewildered people. And what was actually genuine bewilderment and disorientation was dismissed as racism and bigotry. And you get to a point where you're speaking to those people every day, and you realise actually they are right and you are wrong. And at some point you've got to say that publicly, even if it causes you problems personally. Philip said, does Hartlepool need Hampstead as much as Hampstead needs Hartlepool? Yeah, I think it does. As I sort of set out at the opening, Labour, when it's been most successful, has been that electoral compromise, going back right to its foundations. And you can talk about Fabian Society and groups like that. It's always had. It starts, or should start, in my view, with its base, with its traditional core vote, and then always try to reach outwards to that layer of, if you like, middle class liberals who are attracted by the idea, by Labour's ideas, by the idea of a fairer economy and a fairer society. And I don't argue, and I don't argue in the book, that all Labour has to do is somehow rely on its old industrial vote, and that's enough to get it across the line. I think that would be very naive. But as I say, I think that yes, it needs the coalition, it needs Hampstead, but that particular coalition has become completely unbalanced, and the pendulum needs to shift back the other way. And in terms of Philip's other point about the Labour identity, why impose the Labour identity on red wall seats that have rejected Labour? I guess that's one we could debate until the cows come home. Look, I'll be blunt. I'm a Labour Party person. I joined the Labour Party in 1994. I've got all sorts of issues with it at the moment, but for me, it strikes me that it is still probably the vehicle, the best vehicle to deliver advances in favour of working people in this country for all of its faults. You know, we are largely a two-party system. There hasn't been an illustrious history of third parties attempting to break through the scene. The trade union movement is still affiliated to the Labour Party. That's the official voice of workers. There is still, I think, a residual support for the Labour Party in even in some of those red wall seats. And it just strikes me that, you know, you need to make the case for a strong Labour movement across the country. But that certainly doesn't mean going to those red wall seats and doing what we did with the Brexit vote, which is saying to people that you got this wrong. It's about saying, actually, we as a movement need to change. We actually moved away from you. We treated you with disdain, and the obligation is now on us to reconnect with you and to debate things with you on your terms, not on our terms. But listen, I appreciate there's lots of people who share my broader views, but don't necessarily agree with me that the Labour Party is the best party to do it. I get those messages pretty strongly every day, and I think we'll just have to have what we in the Labour Party call a comradely disagreement, I guess, on those things. I think that may have covered it, Mary. I hope so. You're muted, Mary.
Sorry about that. Oh, not on Zoom. Yeah, we've got lots of questions. I'm going to read out 3 at a time, and they're for the whole panel. Give Paul a bit of a rest. Somebody asks whether or not we need to redefine the terms left and right. And another person who, this is a question I have to ask, I've got personal interest in this. There's somebody who is writing, an Italian student who's writing a thesis on Lexit, which I was part of, and asked what you think about Lexit and why didn't it find room in the referendum campaign. And there are a number of questions that ask this kind of thing. What makes the panel think that Labour is salvageable in view of the many problems it faces internally and externally? So do you think it's salvageable? I think there's 3 to get on with, and then there'll be a further 3. So starting with Philip, then Maurice, and then Paul.
Yes, thank you. So I suppose if I go in reverse order, I mean, I don't think the Labour Party is salvageable, I suppose, and I think the core vote, in fact, I mean, the origins of the Labour Party in the late 19th century, the way in which it developed from the kind of upper layers of the trade union bureaucracy and liberal intellectuals, social liberals and reformist liberals, that was its core constituency, in fact, its core vote. And in many ways, I think it's a return to that now. It's been a roughly 100-year cycle, and it's returned to its core origins. And I think where I would, I disagree with Paul is, I think if anything, I think we've lived through a period in which we've seen remarkable inroads by other parties into the British political system. It is UKIP that has had an extraordinarily, even with all the barriers that first past the post sets up in our electoral system, UKIP has had an extraordinary influence on politics. Or if you look at the success of the SNP in dominating Scotland. So I think we're living. I think we can't let continue to think that we live in a functioning and successful two-party system. I think those days are gone. And I think the evidence for successful alternative models, malfunctioning, unappealing in so many ways and limited in so many ways. I'm not a supporter of UKIP or the SNP, needless to say, but the point being that I think we already have plenty of evidence of the crumbling away of the two-party system. not to mention the class realignment that we're seeing in the wake of the 2019 election. So I think we can't let the supposed failure of third parties stand in the way of thinking more systematically and creatively about political options in front of us. And in answer to the Italian student with respect to Lexit, I think I've written about this for the Full Brexit and elsewhere about what I thought were problems with the concept of Lexit. I think was that ultimately it was to cast the question of Brexit in terms of Lexit was to make it sound conditional. So it was made to make Brexit sound as if it was only viable or appealing if it happened to take place or in ways that were on the terms of the left, so that it had to be a left-wing Brexit or not at all. And I think that was always going to be something that was going to fail ultimately, that it would be something that would be politically limited in all sorts of ways. And that ultimately what was represented in the Brexit vote, it was a vote for sovereignty and for greater control. And it is within those terms that the left can seek to reshape society and politics. So I don't think, I think Lexit was a way, importantly, I think it was also, this should tell you a lot about what you need to know about Lexit, is it was a term that was coined by Owen Jones before he obviously plumped for Remain. And the notion was, like I say, that it had to be conditional. And that if it wasn't on our terms, on the terms of the left, then Brexit was unacceptable to us. And I think that was always a defeatist way to view Brexit. And sure enough, it didn't. It simply didn't fly. And the politics of Brexit could be monopolized by the right instead of by the left. So it spoke to the failure of the left and the deep-seated fear that Paul has described, in fact, the fear in the left of mass politics, the fear of mass democracy, the fear of the nation, the fear of national politics. All of these things were manifested in the slogan of Lexit. So I'll leave it there and let the others come back to the questions.
Okay, thanks, Philip, and everybody. And just saying, I'm going through the questions and I'm finding virtually every one of them really interesting. So I'd love people who aren't satisfied, please get in touch. To deal with Alessandra Carraro's question first, that Philip just dealt with about what happened to Labour. Labour was for the majority of its history hostile to the European Union and viewing it as essentially an agent of limiting sovereignty, limiting the possibility of democratic politics to articulate a genuinely different settlement that could challenge the domination of capital. And so, Alessandra, it's essential to look at what happened there, and particularly what happened beginning in the 60s when Labour's political economy, the left's political economy, began to break down. The nationalisation model began to look extremely clunky, and then the inability of Labour and the left generally within Europe to make the distinction between globalisation and internationalism. So it began to view internationalism essentially as capitalism, as the free movement of people, goods, money, and things. And so it put all its weight on, this is going through a lot of the questions, put all its weight on a cultural politics and a politics of human rights that subordinated democracy, that subordinated sovereignty. Just as an aside to Philip there, that democracy and sovereignty are part of this story, in relation not simply to control, but of accountability and of holding rulers both in the economy and in the state accountable. So Alessandra, just to answer your question, there's got to be a long story here about how the left and Labour bought into financial capitalism as the only conceivable form. In other words, a teleology that said that technology was dissolving any sense of place, that class was no longer relevant, that the state didn't have a productive role in the organisation of the economy, and that the only way we could really do things was through a form of sort of liberal constitutionalism that subordinated democracy to treaties that upheld a kind of eternal form of capitalism. That's just the beginning of an answer. In terms, Mary, of what you asked about left and right, you know, I would go back to saying that the critique of capitalism as a dehumanizing system, as a system of commodification that turns human beings and their natural environment into commodities, has to be the starting point for any meaningful left. And there I would agree with Paul, and I would, unusually, Philip, I would agree with you here. You know, is that democratic sovereignty is vital, and the class is vital. So that begins with a critique, but it's not a critique of capitalism that is based exclusively or even primarily on nationalism. It views the nation state as having a form of sovereignty that can resist that sovereignty externally facing has to be democratic, but also the left, I believe, should be committed to the deepening of democracy, both in the economy and in the governance of local life. I think that's a very important. And the third aspect of the left, which Paul brings out really very well in the book, is that we should be committed to the fundamental liberties. I mean, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of association. These are, and freedom of expression. And what we see, there's a fantastic Greek word called enantiodromia, which is the turning of something into its opposite as the extremes. And in its response to globalization, the left, in many ways, has become an ally of capitalism, an enemy of liberty, hostile to democracy. And that leads to the answer. So why? People are asking, why am I still committed to Labour? Well, you know, in relation to, as one person said in the tweet, I'm faithful to the Labour tradition, that this is a kind of miracle that happened, that Labour brought out a broad-based class coalition. It was the first organisation in Britain to build a common ground between Catholic and Protestant. We forget about that, but it rejected, you know, the cooperative burial societies were the first institutions in the country to offer a burial to people bound by mutual obligation to Catholic, Protestant, and to atheist. You know, it built a common good between essentially a dehumanized and demoralized group, which was the proletariat or the working class, and gave them human form. It was faithful to the liberties on the whole, round about up to 1970. And so there is a great deal, I would say, Philip, in the Labour tradition that is of tremendous value and that I hold very, very dear. But Paul's right, you know, what's required is a genuinely honest reflection, drawing upon those traditions and renewing them. But those fundamental things, a rejection of capitalism as a form of commodification, the defense of the human status of the person, the defense of the human status of the worker is absolutely vital. The deepening and strengthening of democracy, particularly in the economy, and the defense of the liberties, those are the areas where I would define the left and where I would be, I think, faithful to a Labour tradition. There you go. Mary, you're muted.
Paul, do you want to come back on any of this? Paul?
Yeah, I'm just unmuting myself. Yeah, I'll come back. I mean, they were quite full answers, but I'll come back on a couple of points if I can. I mean, in terms of whether the sort of left-right spectrum is dead, I don't know. I mean, certainly, I think one thing that Jeremy Corbyn did say, and I think he was right on it, was that it's useless to a certain degree, because unless people accept that the centre ground sometimes shifts, which of course it does, then you get a distorted picture. And I always feel that the term centrist is used by people who want to give the impression that their view, they describe themselves as centrists. It's a way of giving the impression that their view is really the common sense mainstream view, and a way of dismissing everybody else's view as kind of being on the fringes and being on the extremes. And it strikes me actually that you often find with centrists that their ideologies are as strident and as fanatical as anybody else's. So I have some sympathy with the idea that the spectrum is dead, though what we replace it with, I don't know. I'd like to touch on the Lexit point. I actually never described myself as a Lexiteer during the referendum campaign. I was pro-Brexit, but I wasn't a Lexiteer because it struck me that there was never going to be, I think Philip touched on some of this stuff, there was never going to be a left-wing exit from the European Union. As much as I wanted to leave the European Union, I recognised that the day that we left, there was still likely to be a Tory government in charge, a Tory government that had been imposing austerity, that had a negative impact on working class communities. But for me, it wasn't, I never believed that Britain was going to become a land of milk and honey immediately that we left the European Union. For me, the Brexit vote was simply about clearing the path for something better, ideally, in my view, a radical Labour government at some point in the future to be able to come along and do the things that we would want a Labour government to do, free from the shackles of the European Union and from some of the restrictive rules of the European Union around state aid and public ownership and that kind of thing. I've always argued that the European Union is an explicitly anti-socialist institution, and socialism before Brexit was impossible. It needed to be the other way around, and it was about getting out of the European Union so that we could have the power of a democratically elected national government managing the economy in the interests of working people, rather than relying on technocrats in Brussels to do it for us. So I was a Brexiteer, and although I'm on the left, I never described myself as a Lexiteer for those reasons. I think I'll probably leave it there, Mary.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to ask, there's so many questions. What I hope is that if your question isn't answered, that it could still be, because there is an answer. We can answer it offline. So I'm going to go to 3 more questions, and I'm going to ask the panelists you don't have to answer all 3 of them, to be as brief as you can so we can get more in. So there's a number of questions about culture. What do you consider is working class culture? How has it changed, or is it likely to change? What do you understand by culture wars? This is just a term that is used by the middle class media. A very important question from a councillor in Hartlepool, who says that Hartlepool is on its knees. How can we unite voters? And that really is tied in with another question, which basically says, what action would you immediately take to help to resolve the situation that you describe? And thirdly, and this is the question, I think, can the working class interest be pursued without ending capitalism? Don't we need a socialist society? I'll leave you with those 3. You don't necessarily think you've got to answer all 3 of them, but I hope that between you will. So I'm going to start with Maurice, then Paul, then Philip.
Okay, thanks, Mary. I think I've unmuted myself, so I'm in order. Yeah, I'm very engaged with the situation of Hartlepool, and what you see there in Hartlepool is not only the abandonment of Hartlepool by capital, but also the destructions of virtually all of its civic institutions. They're removing the sixth form college, the A&E is moving out. So what is required in Hartlepool is a very neglected Labour tradition, which is organising someone, people to go out, listen, and bring people together around issues that unite local people, and that you can campaign on in order to restore trust. I mean, there's something lurking in Paul's book and in the conversation generally, which is such is the scale of disaffection, and such is the scale of the breakdown of affection for Labour and the role of Labour and trade unions in people's lives, that there's absolutely, you know, no saying that the government we've got now, when the disaffection kicks in, that there won't be a very ugly politics that will replace it, a politics of resentment, a politics built around precisely racial and religious divisions. So I just wanted to add that as another reason why I still remain faithful to the Labour tradition as a way and renewing neglected parts of it, and part of that is organising. So part of that, to say to Amy and to Anthony, who are on the call from Hartlepool, is to engage with building a programme and a vision of what we do, built around restoring assets and institutions and a civic ecology in Hartlepool, that these are political. So when Paul refers to it quite a bit in the book about the common good, you know, the common good is a recognition of plurality and a recognition of division, and moving towards a politics that tries to bring people together rather than exacerbate polarisation, and the possibility of human solidarity in the face of inhuman forces. And I guess, Philip, that's part of our conversation as it will roll on through time, is the state can be a dehumanising force every bit as much as the market. And how do you form human associations that uphold the dignity of the person is vital to that. And so through the prism of Hartlepool, I think we can begin to see how far we are away. But just to say to Amy and Anthony that it's vital that we develop a politics around that, and the politics that gives a central role to place as well as to class, and to democracy in that place through the renewal of the institutional ecology. And the second point I'll deal with that Mary asked is relating to capital. So there is a need to domesticate capital, to defy the process of commodification. But one of the aspects, and this relates back to the point answer to Alessandra, is that there really, in terms of the communication of what people want within a complex society, the left hasn't developed an adequate response to the price system in that regard. So there is a place for markets, but just not for markets in human beings and the natural environment, and how we build institutions and structures that uphold the integrity of those things is vital. I'll leave it there, Mary.
Philip or Paul, do you want to come back on any of them or not?
Sure, I'm happy to come back, or if Paul wants to go first, whichever. I suppose so. Okay, I'll quickly take the three questions that Mary raised. On culture wars, I think what's important to see how they've kind of developed, I think, is that they're the form that social disagreement has, the way in which it's occurred, I think, in the aftermath of globalization and technocracy. So when so much constraint has been put into politics, when so many decisions have been extracted from democratic deliberation, extracted from the purview of the nation state, and kind of elevated and embedded into the European Union, or has gone down kind of to say devolved governments, or to quangos, or all those ways in which public power has been restrained and hemmed in, has led to these kind of fierce squalls over questions of identity and grievance. So I think culture wars is very much the flip side of technocracy and globalization and limited power, limited the limits which have been put in around the exercise of political power. And I think that that kind of interdependence needs to be remembered. To the councillor in Hartlepool and the question of voters and people in Hartlepool, the immediate action I think that should happen at the moment is ending the lockdown. The second, I mean, I think the first lockdown was bad enough, but the second lockdown should surely be unjustified, cannot be justified, and speaks to the deep failure of the state in the interim, that it has failed to provide the public capacity and the planning to be able to avoid a second lockdown after having engaged in the first. And I think it's very difficult to understate just how damaging it is, not only to the economy and to people's livelihoods and jobs, but just to the very basic, most I mean, the very fact that we're having this conversation like this, I think, speaks to just how damaging it is to just the most basic forms of social life and association. So the most immediate thing, I think, irrespective of where people sit on the political spectrum, would be to bring the lockdown to an end as swiftly as possible, and to restore civic and social life, and to let people return to their normal lives. And for the kind of, I think also I would say to people and to the people who are listening, who are attending from Hartlepool, is that I suspect that voters in the red wall seats realise that they no longer live in a single party state. They've voted the Tories into office. It's no longer a single party state dominated by one party, the Labour Party, and they realise that they live in swing states now. And I think, and I hope that they would take full advantage of that to their benefit. On the one hand, I think it's perfectly possible, I think, that Labour may win back some of the red wall seats. But as my colleague here at the University of Kent, Man Goodwin, has shown, there are also more red wall seats to fall to the Tories. So I think if people in those constituencies see themselves as swing voters, and that they can squeeze central government, and that they can squeeze the parties for things that they've been denied for so long, and that they can gain they can extract greater concessions and promises from politicians and from parties, so much the better for them. So I think now that they've been thrust forward into the position of swing states, I think that's should be to their benefit. And then finally, to the question of if the working class interest requires overthrowing capitalism, I suppose what's most striking to me is how much the pandemic and the response to the pandemic has revealed just how deeply the deep kind of way in which capitalism has cut into the social fabric, to the extent that our public capacity has been so hollowed out and so stripped bare that when the pandemic arrived, there wasn't even a single warehouse which had a stock of PPE that was fit for purpose. If anything, has exposed the just how hostile and threatening to society capitalism is. I think it has to be the way in which society and state has crumbled in the wake of the pandemic, and yet there seems to be nobody who's in a position to nobody in a kind of position of political power and influence who's able to speak to that and to channel opposition to it in that way. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. There's so many questions. I'm going to just go. There's another three, I think, that are well, they're not brief actually. When, in your opinion, did the Labour Party move away from the working class? One question. Should we blame it all on higher education, i.e., creating a new D-class working class, or middle class, if you like? Why are the ideas that have been expressed by Paul and others so vilified? And I suppose in conjunction with that is that there's a point that somebody's made about whether or not your arguments just boil down to anti-intellectualism, and do you need to resort to that in your critique of others? So, do you want to start, Paul?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll let the intellectuals on the panel deal with the questions about intellectualism. That might be the best thing. I'll pick up, if I can, on the interesting question about when did Labour move away from the working class. I mean, in the book, I trace it to roughly about the 1980s, the late 1980s. And I talk about how at that point in time, people began to exert influence in the party who had kind of been through the cultural revolutions of the 1960s as young people and as students, and then had worked their way up through the labour movement, and then started to get their hands on the levers of power in the late 1980s. And Labour seemed to me, as I describe it in the book at that time, to adopt this or to swallow this poisonous brew of economic and social liberalism. Economic liberalism, I think, because they'd been battered by Margaret Thatcher. She, by that time, had won 3 elections on the bounce, 79, 83, 87. She'd imposed her version of monetarism, as it was called, which is about rolling back the frontiers of the state, privatising, leaving everything to the market. And Labour felt that actually, if we're ever going to win power again, we need to adopt some of this stuff. And I think that continued largely through the Blair years, and then when the real impacts of globalisation hit, I think in the first decade of this century, I think that's when the rupture between Labour and the working class really began to intensify. But I think what happened is, because at the time, I think in the late 90s, I think many working class people were frankly so keen to get rid of the Tories, they threw their lot in with Blair, and then again in 2001, when frankly the Tories were still a bit of a mess and not really a serious alternative for government. But then I think in that decade, when globalisation did start to hit, and when the impact of globalisation in terms of its social and economic disruptions that it brought in local communities began to hit, people who until then had been quite loyal to Labour started to look elsewhere, and they were drawn at that time to the likes of UKIP and the BNP. The BNP made great surges, as we know, in the first decade of that century. And I think Labour miscalculated, because it believed that the working class had nowhere else to go. But there was a point in time where the working class decided, actually, you know, you may think that, but if that's the case, we're just going to abstain, or there's these new people coming along with the BNP and UKIP who are speaking our language, and you know they're talking about the impacts on globalisation and free movement on our communities, and Labour's not interested in this, and that, I think, is when the rot really began to well, it set in before then, but I think that's when the rupture began to intensify. So I think actually I'll leave it there, Mary, because I want the others to have a say as well. I was going to come on to something else, but I'll leave it there if that's okay.
Well, Maurice or Philip, the floor is yours.
It was gunslinging. It was whoever could unmute first, you know, and I got there. You know, just to respond very briefly, I actually see 1945 as the turning point, when a top-down, centralised managerial form of engaging with the economy that gave no space for the participation of workers in the governance of industry, that was actually very hostile to the, you know, to place and to the development of places, but we could discuss about, but it definitely, I think, Paul, intensified in the 60s, and the point which relates to the anti-intellectualism is that I can still remember when there was a very rough and ready public debate in the Labour movement about many things, not least in the European Community referendum in the 70s, where there was a very intense argument at a much higher level. But what's happened is a shutting down of intellectualism right across the board, a resistance, and Paul brings it out in the book, a resistance to public debate that people can, I think, consider to be very hostile. So very far from being anti-intellectual, what's happened is universities in some way have become anti-intellectual, actually closing down debates and things like that. And and then the answer to why the ideas expressed by Paul and generally received with such enormous hostility, because the fundamental assumptions concerning the direction of history, the teleology of history towards a borderless technological world bound by human rights has broken down. And so Paul basically, and loads of us, you know, take a kicking because the theory of history is so mistaken. And I think that's really important. I mean, Angela raises the point in the notes, you know, we're unable to articulate a vision of a good life. And, you know, this is the, you know, a fundamental problem. In order to do that, we've got to draw on traditions that were a constitutive part of Labour, but are no longer. And part of those relate to the Aristotelian tradition, to Christian traditions of community, of the good life, of covenant, of the integrity of the human person, and the whole debate around virtue ethics that's going on that I think is really important. But that cannot be done within what Paul articulates is a hyper-economic and political liberalism. It can't be done within that frame. There has to be a notion of the person as a social being who longs for attachment, association with others, and then to develop a politics which can actually, where there is a public space where there can be robust disagreement, and that's decided by democracy. And these are a whole set of ideas of democracy, the state, sovereignty, the common good and class have somehow become alien to the left, alien to Labour, and they need to be reinserted. So once again, Paul, you may not get thanked for it on Twitter, but I think you've done a real service.
You're muted, Mary.
Okay. Right. Well, somebody suggested that that the selection of the questions here show bias. I'm trying not to be biased at all. I'm trying to group them. I can't recall whether the question about higher education was raised, because there's a very good one here saying, well, what's been the role of academia? If we send our children to university for a liberal education, should we be surprised if we turn out liberal thought and alienation from their original class consciousness? I think it might be an idea to have a little stab at that. It relates also to that question about the role of expansion of higher education in the Blair years. What do panelists think about that?
I'm happy to try and tackle that one. So I mean, a lot of, I suppose I would say, you know, a lot of there's been a lot of, and this is prompted by David Goodhart, a lot of emphasis on the role that higher education has played in terms of the culture wars and cultural values and the way things have, many of the kind of maladies of the public sphere that we see. And I think a lot of the criticism is justified. The elements, I suppose, that I think are important to add to it is that it was an enormous attempt to try and transform the character of British society, and I still think in many ways its significance has been underestimated. And in the process, of course, higher education was completely, its role and purpose was also completely transformed. So the idea was that as a response to globalization, if you educated, you know, if you could educate a certain amount of population, you'd produce these highly informed, kind of technically skilled, nimble and agile individuals who are ready to adapt to whatever the global economy demanded of them, and that this would be provided by universities, and at the same time it would key into the new kind of middle class vision that New Labour promoted. And at the same time, of course, higher education became a substitute for fiscal policy, for incomes policy, for interventions to tackle inequality. And all of this is very evident to anyone who works in higher education. So, I mean, I'm speaking from experience. All the things that higher education is supposed to solve now, we're supposed to kind of compensate for the failure of schools. We're supposed to compensate for inequality between different ethnic groups, between classes. We're supposed to kind of achieve a level of social transformation transformation. So all of the things, all of the kind of tasks that the state abandoned has been, in many ways, have been rerouted through the academy, and in the process the academy itself has been transformed and degraded. And the other element I'd say to that is, I think there's also been the complete collapse of the academic profession, its demoralization and its turning inwards. And I think this is very evident, for instance, in the behavior of my union, to my shame, the University College Union, and its attempt effectively to eliminate what remains of face-to-face teaching on campus. Its attempt to shut down campuses entirely, despite the fact that students are one of the least, the groups that are least vulnerable, least at risk from COVID, and students who are vulnerable are not pressured to come onto campus. And the fact that that the academics have retreated effectively, have treated their students as if they're nothing but bags of germs and disease, and have found it intolerable to be in the same room as their students over the course of this year, over the course of the pandemic and the lockdown. I think that speaks to a collapse of any sense of public ethos, an orientation towards society, an orientation towards any notion of public good, or even just basic minimal kind of professional competence and the ethos of the profession and what its duties are. So I think the social erosion that we've seen is profound and deep.
Philip.
Sorry, yeah.
Look, we've only got 5 minutes left. There is one final question. Well, there's loads more questions, but there's one I'm going to put to you, which I think could enable each of you in the way that we deal with it. I'm not. Did you hear the first bit? The host unmuted me. One final question, which each of you, I'd like each of you to answer, and it might really entail you bringing this all in together with your closing remarks, because we've got 5 minutes left. The question is, how do we stop them conning the working class by pretending that they get it when they're simply paying lip service? Do you think the electorate is now inured to that? What are the changes which would be both material and symbolic in a way which would both comprise change and signal no way back? It's a theory and practice question. So starting with Philip, then Maurice, and the final word to Paul, and these will be your final words.
To signal no way back, I think, would require that we draw more on the politics of Brexit. I think so. What the politics of Brexit demanded was it was a demand for greater control of people's lives, for greater control of the economy, for greater control of their social circumstances, and for greater capacity to shape politics and to shape the public sphere. And I think, as anything at this particular point, I think that gives people greater control and greater capacity politically to shape their social life and their context, I think would be to the good, and also would help to propel us out of the kind of trough that we find ourselves in at the end of this truly dismal year.
Thanks, Philip. Maurice.
Yeah, I think to go back to Paul's thing, we've got to grasp the possibilities of Brexit in terms of developing an industrial strategy that can bring revitalised life to places, that restores the status of work and the dignity of work, so an equal regard to vocational education as well as academic education, civic institutions through which people can participate in their self-government. That's the vital way, is to fully embrace the democratic possibilities that are opened up by Brexit in a pro-worker industrial strategy.
Thanks, Maurice. Paul.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, actually, because it was clear to me, I mean, I've touched on quite a bit the experience in Barking and Dagenham in the first decade of this century, and one thing that was so apparent was the way in which politicians did pay lip service to people. And we'd often say, well, of course, we have to listen to people's concerns. But people were saying, look, we don't just want you to listen to our concerns, we actually want you to do something about it. It isn't just about listening to us and then forgetting what we've said. It's about enacting policies that deliver for us and that improve our lives and that actually prevent some of the negative stuff that you've been imposing on us. So it's about action and not just promises. That's certainly true. And I agree with Philip and Maurice. Brexit, I think, is a big part of that. I think the left has got to forget any designs of stopping it or messing around with it. I have to say I'm quite pleased that Keir Starmer, for all of his faults throughout the whole Brexit debate, particularly being the architects of the disastrous second referendum policy, appears to have jettisoned a lot of that now, and he's saying to his MPs, look, you know, we've got to accept this is done, and we can't reopen the wound. Brexit is going to happen, and we've got to be sure we don't stand in the way of it. I think some of the messaging will be important, you know, around, and some of this I think has been fairly good over the last few months from Labour in terms of the importance of family and patriotism, and perhaps getting off some of the fringe issues, some of the secondary issues, some of the more middle class concerns that have obsessed the party over recent times. So that's what I would say in terms of, you know, what needs to happen to re-engage and reconnect with the people that we've been talking about. Can I just, as this is my last go, Mary, can I just take the really quick opportunity to say thanks to everybody, particularly thanks to you for chairing it so brilliantly, to Philip, to Maurice, to Lee for their involvement a Friday evening. They're not being paid as far as I know, so it's really good of them to turn out, but most importantly to everyone who's tuned in. I think it's been a really good discussion. I'm extremely grateful for everyone taking the time to either participate or to listen.
Well, thank you. Friday evening's quite hard for Maurice and me, but we're here and we're glad we're here. And I'd like, on behalf of this unseen audience of, well, 140 odd, I'd like to thank the speakers very, very much indeed. And to those of you who asked the many, many questions, many of which have not been answered, the full Brexit asks you to put your questions to the panellists on Twitter if you're there, Paul Embery, and at Philip at the Philippics. Well, anyway, it's in the chat. So please pursue the discussion, and please all subscribe to the full Brexit. The full Brexit has put this on. It does an awful lot of stuff. We've got a very good website, very good articles and contributions. Please contribute to it. Once again, thank you so much to all the speakers. I think it's been a very, very useful discussion. And the fact is that if we haven't got controversy and we don't have debate and discussion, how can we ever really have considered ideas when they're not challenged? So I think that I don't believe in free speech. I don't think anything's free, but I do believe in constructive debate, constructive criticism, in order to provide for us a way forward which can get us out of the mess that we're in and forward to a much better society. So thank you very, very much indeed, everybody. And thank you to the participants who I haven't seen, but I know they're there. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Okay. Bye, pals.
Bye.
Going.